Welcome to the fourth Dean's Lecture for the year. My name is David Beckett and I'm the Acting Dean, Deputy Dean at the moment, Acting Dean of the Graduate School. Dean Phil Rickards is overseas, having a well-earned break, and it's my great pleasure to step into his role as MC this evening. I would like to formally start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional custodians of this land. I pay respects to the elders, both past and present, of the Kulin Nation, and I extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians who may be present. One of the reasons tonight is a very special night is it's not only the return of the Dean's Lecture Series after a short break over winter, but we also welcome this year our first international guest lecturer for the year, Professor David Berliner from Arizona State University. Emeritus Professor Patrick Griffin, our colleague, will introduce Professor Berliner, and I've asked my colleague Professor John Hattie to thank David at the lecture's conclusion. So please welcome Patrick to the front.
Thanks, David Beckett, and it's good to welcome and introduce David Berliner, Emeritus Professor, Regents Professor Emeritus at Arizona State University. I don't know what the collective noun is for emeritus professors, but there's a whole gaggle of them here tonight. And that may well become the collective noun for emeritus professors. What we have here is the Assembly of the International Academy of Education, and it seems to me that perhaps one of the guiding principles is that that tag should be on somebody's name to get admitted to this academy. But it is a pleasure to introduce David Berliner, the Regents Professor Emeritus at Arizona State University. And in a career lasting more than 4 decades, David has achieved a great deal. First of all, he's had a substantial impact on education through his research on instructional time and its effect on the achievement, which had yielded a concept called academic learning time. He also developed, with researchers, to the metric of learning through this academic learning time. His research on expert teachers, in which he was able to show that not only do they exist, but they are superb individuals and often create enormous wealth of intellectual power in the schools in which they work. His policy work is also quite influential, and he has spent a lot of time debunking the charges that schools and teachers are failing. He looks more towards the positives and the successes of those. His educational textbook on educational psychology with Nate Gage has had 5 editions over 25 years and has influenced teacher education in America, Australia and Europe. On a more personal note, his 2 children have chosen a career in education. One is a professor of French history in Baltimore, and the other is an education researcher in West Ed in San Francisco. He recognises the influence on his own career of 2 quite famous names. One, Lee Crombach, but most people in education would be familiar with that. And Nate Gage also influenced his career in an interesting way. And David's paper on how these 2 influenced his career probably should be read by every postgraduate student, because he describes how when he first met Crombach and Nate Gage, they told him to go away and learn to write, which he did. And they almost terminated his career in education, but like great teachers, they've led David through that process to become as influential as indeed they were. His biggest concerns outside the Academy of Education are political. He passionately believes that the United States should and could be a better country if they had to get their education fixed. This evening, his views will be elaborated upon in terms of the way in which we evaluate teachers and perhaps misplace the metrics that are used. And I think we should fasten seatbelts because when David goes out on a limb, he really does. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Thank you all for coming here. I will go out on a limb. I haven't done much with this concept, so you're getting it pretty new. So I want to thank you for the invitation to try to present you with these ideas. I want to also thank Dr. Marg Malik and Victoria University and Dr. Len Cairns of Monash University for putting us up this week so I could write this paper. And I mention them also so you will have someone local to yell at if you don't like what I have to say. So I give you their names and addresses and you can have at them. I do hope you find what I say of interest and as a cautionary tale. You know, education policies in the United States, they drift across borders, okay? And they drift over here, they drift up to Canada, even if they're no good. But the policies of the US are powerful. And one of them has to do with evaluating teachers with student standardized tests. So that's what I want to talk about now. And since I only have about 45 minutes, I'm going to slowly go through about half my talk and then speed up and run you through the last half, okay? The desire to evaluate the competency of teachers based on the results of standardized achievement tests administered to their students is long-standing. I was an advocate of this early in my career. As a behavioral psychologist, reasonably well-grounded in tests and measures, I thought valid assessments of teacher competency could be obtained, and so by getting rid of bad teachers and keeping good teachers, American education would thrive. This kind of thinking is characteristic of the general public, of many economists, and of a host of my nation's industrial and political leaders, particularly the Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, and our President, Barack Obama. In addition, many of these same individuals and organizations believe that America's schools of education ought also to be judged on the standardized achievement test scores obtained by the students of the graduates of those schools. The logic is that if teachers cannot get good standardized achievement test scores out of their students, the schools of education that trained them should be improved or shut down. I'm not going to mince words. Evaluating teachers and teacher training institutions by means of the scores students obtain on standardized achievement tests is ridiculous. My harsh criticism of so many influential academics and other leaders in America is not just based on some romantic notion of teaching, though I have that. And it's not just based on an anti-testing, anti-quantitative bias. You heard I studied with Lee J. Cronbach, who we referred to as God when we were going to school in statistics and measurement. But I want to share with you tonight 14 reasons, big and small, for my judgment that assessing teacher competence with standardized achievement tests is nearly worthless. As time goes on, I'll skip, I'll elaborate, but the first part, I'm going to try to convince you that teachers' effects on the scores students get on these tests are close to undetectable. What? Did I just say that tests cannot measure teachers' effects on students? No, I did not say that. I said that teachers' effects are barely noticeable on standardized tests of achievement. It is a simple validity problem that I present. And I really now think of Cronbach, who pounded validity into my head when I was a graduate student, and I didn't realize how much this paper may be related to that pounding. It's a simple validity problem that I present, namely whether a perfectly reasonable achievement test for assessing students' knowledge and skills can also be used to assess teacher competency. If that is not the case, then using the same test to judge institutional excellence is equally unwarranted. Note, this is not a criticism of standardized achievement tests for inferring student knowledge and skill. It's about using those same tests for making inferences about teachers and schools. That's quite different, that I'm trying to play off with each other. This is not about standardized achievement tests and kids. This is about standardized achievement tests and inferences about teaching and the quality of schooling they're getting, okay? So I need that clear. I started making notes for this paper when Secretary Duncan announced plans for a revolutionary change in the evaluation of teacher education programs. He promised to, quote, reward states that publicly report and link student achievement data to the programs where teachers were credentialed, unquote. He called for a shift in focus from examining program inputs and program characteristics to looking primarily at program outputs. The Secretary wants to measure program effectiveness by means of standardized achievement test scores obtained during the first few years of teaching by new teachers. He proposed that this be done using value-added models of evaluation called VAMs, and all the current versions of VAMs require student assessment by means of standardized achievement tests, measuring the growth between different administrations of the tests. But it is exactly those tests that I contend have inadequate validity to make any worthwhile inference about the quality of teachers or the programs that train them. For one, most of these tests do not measure growth, since they are not vertically scaled. So a score on a fourth grade test and a score on a fifth grade test are merely scores on two different tests. There's no growth between them, because they were never scaled that way. So talking about growth models gets a little tricky, but that's a separate issue. In one speech, Secretary Duncan proudly held up the example of Louisiana, the first state to have put into effect this ridiculous program of evaluating schools of education with student test scores. For your information, Louisiana has some of the lowest standardized achievement test scores in the country. Using the Secretary's logic from scores this low, we can infer that Louisiana must have the least successful teacher training institutions and the most incompetent teachers in the country. The counter-hypothesis, of course, is that Louisiana is a horrible place in which to grow up poor. Louisiana's teacher preparation programs send most of their graduates to schools with some of the highest rates of childhood poverty in the nation. It is also a state with one of the highest levels of inequality in the nation. Could those factors influence standardized achievement test scores? The Secretary and other politicians who want to evaluate the state's teacher education programs and the classroom teachers by means of standardized test scores blithely ignore who it is that is being taught and thus, of course, who it is that is being tested. They seek a way to assign blame for what is perceived to be inadequate performance on standardized tests. Teachers and teacher preparation programs are perfect targets to take legislators' minds off of all the poverty and inequality that makes some of America's education systems an international embarrassment. Blaming teacher education programs and the teachers they produce for disappointing standardized achievement test scores appears to me to be a diversion of the type used by successful magicians. Blaming institutions and individual teachers directs our gaze away from the inequality and poverty that actually gives rise to those scores. In the same way, a magician can divert attention of an entire audience when they make a person or a rabbit disappear. So with the scheme proposed by the Secretary, where scores and not the context for the scores are examined, we might easily make an invalid inference from the very real finding that on standardized tests, some states and some districts and some schools are greatly underperforming those in other states and other districts and other schools. Here's a fact that seems not to be of interest to the Secretary and others. Australia is here near the average about 20%. This is the percentage of teaching in a country working in schools with more than 30% of the students from very disadvantaged homes. Now, who leads the world, the developed world? It's called the United States of America. We have 64% of our teachers teaching in schools where over 30% of the kids are in poverty. Australia doesn't come close to that. Other nations, particularly in the Northern European ones, are very, very low. Well, making inferences about our teachers when so many of them are in schools that are loaded with kids that are in poverty is very hard to do, I think. What does this mean? If poverty affects standardized test scores, and I think everyone here knows it does, and you cannot completely control for that poverty statistically, which is always the case, then the teachers in those schools will more often than not be labeled incompetent for reasons that are not appropriate. So the first of my 14 points is this. When using standardized achievement tests as the basis for inferences about the quality of teachers and the institutions from which they came, it is easy to confuse the effects of sociological variables on standardized test scores for the effects that teachers have on those test scores. Here's one example, again, of how this might occur. In New York City, chronic absenteeism is defined as over 1 month of absences per school year. Shown here are chronic absenteeism rates from schools close to the neighborhood in which I grew up. In fact, the neighborhood was next to Morrisania, the first school on there. I call your attention to Middle School 301, a school in which over 90% of the students are poor and almost 50% of the school students are chronically absent. Will standardized achievement tests given at any of these schools properly assess the competence of the teachers or the quality of the universities that trained them? It should be plain that sociological variables, not instructional variables, will be the major influence on the standardized achievement test scores from these schools. Let me provide one more example of how sociological effects are easily confused with instructional effects using Australian data from a standardized achievement test, PISA. If you go down the rows, you're looking at 5 levels of family income. So row 1 are the poorest kids, 2, 3, 4, 5. Row 5 are the richest kids in terms of family income. If you go across the columns, you're talking about schools and who they serve. The first column are schools that serve the lowest income people, and the 5th column over are schools that serve the wealthiest people, okay? So that's the graph, the table. In the center there, a middle-class kid in a middle-class school, in a school that serves middle-class kids. Kid scored 512, about the average of a pizza score. So the kid, middle-class kid, school that serves middle class, you get an average score. But what else do we learn from these data? Just a little surround. If you look across the schools that serve different income groups, the scores go up rather dramatically. Tells us something about how powerful the cohort you go to school is. If you go down one of the columns in which family income increases, it shows you how much family income matters in the scores that kids obtain. And that's just staying close to that center group. If you go down that center column in family income from 471 to 501 to 512 to 531 to 550, you're seeing the effects of family income on test scores in Australia, on PISA scores. If you go across the columns, you're going to see what happens to schools that serve different income groups, and the scores go way up. And here's the most important. Cell 11 and cell 55 are way out of line with anything you can imagine. Those people who come out of those schools will not meet each other in life, okay, unless one is the servant of the other, okay? This is really, really what's happening. And I asked my Australian friends to tell me if the teachers are really different in quality. And they all agreed that in maybe cell 11, they're probably newer teachers. These are probably rural areas. These are probably indigenous people. These are hard schools to teach in, and maybe the newest teachers get there. But in most of these other places, you're talking about the Australian system in which teacher quality is not that variable from district to district. So inferences made from these data about the quality of the school, about the quality of instruction, about the quality of the teachers strike me as ludicrous, okay? It's about sociology, not instruction, that we're dealing with here. Professor Willems, who's here tonight, has presented similar data. He found that in almost all countries that took PISA and PEARLS tests, an average scoring child, take the average scoring child attending the lowest achieving schools in that nation, or the highest achieving schools in the nation, and what would they look like at age 15 when they take the PISA? The answer is they're likely to be 4 grade levels apart. That's a lot. Just take an average kid, move them here, move them there. That's a lot. Do we want to blame the teachers? Do we want to blame the schools? Do we want to blame the curriculum? Or are we dealing with very powerful sociological variables and cohorts and their influence on schools? Let me switch the argument. Let's move from the teaching profession to other domains to see how odd, how illogical, how bizarre it is to place the blame for outcomes on those that are not the proximal or direct cause of the problems identified. Suppose a distraught parishioner has been seeing his minister and subsequently commits suicide. Is the minister or the program that trained the minister in pastoral duties a failure? Perhaps, but characteristics of the parishioner are much more likely to be the decisive factor. If a child kills another, do the child's parents ever go to jail? In law, unlike in Secretary Duncan's world, we do not hold people or institutions accountable for the actions of others. Certainly it is true that in some countries families are called to provide reparations if one of their children does something wrong. It's instructive that we often call these countries primitive. And our laws, Western laws, such as those in the USA and Australia, do not subscribe to this logic. We've come a long way from Hammurabi. So my second point is that the logic of holding schools of education responsible for student achievement does not fit into our system of law or into the moral code subscribed to by most Western nations. You can't hold these people responsible for these people who are responsible for those people and work your way back, okay? My next point is related. I want to ask if medical schools ought to be held responsible for the health of the patients cared for by their graduates. In terms of the American system in need of reform, medicine is clearly it. You hear all about our schools. You don't know the half of it. It's medicine that's our problem. Here's data on longevity. The United States is down there. We live an average of 78.7 years. There's Australia up there. You're living 82 years. You have 1,205 more days life expectancy than my family, and frankly, it pisses me off. Okay? So when we talk about the life and death education system, education's a matter of survival. I'm talking about real life and death here, and we're not doing well on an international metric. Okay? I would argue that the metric for judging our practicing physicians and the medical schools from which they came is like using standardized achievement test scores as the metric for judging our teachers and the institutions from which they came. Using the logic applied to our field of education, what is clear is that America's institutes for medical training are terribly deficient, since our physicians, compared to physicians in other countries, including yours, are doing much better. This ranking is analogous to the interpretation of the PISA tests provided by newspapers and politicians across the USA, but the metric is just in years lived rather than scores on achievement tests. Instead of the metaphorical life and death situation my country is said to be in over our education system, we actually have life and death data to examine. And can it be much clearer, given the logic used to describe our education system, that our physicians and the schools that train them are killing us? Literally, killing us. If our Secretary of Education were suddenly made Secretary for Health and Human Services, and he listened carefully to some of our most articulate economists, perhaps he would fire the bottom 5 or 10% of the physicians whose patients die young. He might also close the institutions that graduate the most physicians who serve the poor, because they're dying many years before the rich do. What I'm trying to point out is that there are disturbing differences in how we treat longevity gaps in health compared to the achievement gaps we see in education. We have reliable evidence that family income and longevity is strongly related, probably just as causally related as is family income and standardized test performance. But recognition of that relationship is often assiduously ignored by education's policymakers who like to remind teachers that poverty is no excuse. Why then does poverty seem quite acceptable as an explanation for the huge gap in longevity in the USA when comparing upper income white people with others? Nobody in my country is suggesting that the physicians who work with minorities and the poor are incompetent, just the opposite. We often say how noble they are. No one seems to be yelling at physicians to up their game to do better. No one seems to be demanding higher examination scores for the applicants of medical school. No one is trying to close the medical schools from which these physicians came. And no one is proposing Heal for America so recent college grads can spend 2 years in an inner city emergency room. My point is that poverty is regularly understood as the reason for the gap on the metric we use to judge physicians, while poverty is often denied as the source of the gap we see in the metric used to judge teachers. We see, therefore, that there is precedent for holding professionals harmless for their lower success rates with clients who have observable difficulties in meeting the demands and the expectations of the professionals who attend to them. But the dispensation we offer to physicians is not offered to teachers. Let me move to a fourth point. People accept the fact that treatment in medicine may not result in the cure of a disease. Practicing good medicine is the goal, whether or not the patient gets better or lives. It is equally true that competent teaching can occur independent of learning, although this appears to be too difficult a concept for our Secretary of Education. For example, if I go hunting or fishing and come home with nary a turkey or a barramundi, was I hunting? Was I fishing? If I say I'm a salesperson, does that mean I hold a certain position in which certain behaviors are required of me, or does it mean I actually got somebody to buy what I was just selling? If I spend my day teaching my dog to whistle, and the stupid dog does not learn how to do so, was I teaching? My point is that teaching well or teaching poorly can be judged independent of whether students learn or not. This is a common confusion of the task meaning of the words hunting, fishing, selling, and teaching with the achievement meaning of the words. The linkage of these items to the notion of achievement requires that turkeys or barramundi be brought home, that selling bring about a purchase, or that demonstrations of learning actually take place. What is important here is that logically, good teaching and good teacher education can be judged independent of what it is that students learn. I have a couple of philosopher friends in the audience. Did I get Ryle right? Yeah, okay. Okay. How might we do that? We could have well-respected other teachers observe and evaluate classroom practices in order to judge the quality of teaching. They can judge the artifacts of life in a classroom, such as the quality of the tests given in the classroom, the quality of the answers given to those tests, the interactions of teachers and students, the nature of the teacher's responses to papers handed in, etc. Artifacts from life in classrooms provides a reasonable set of indicators of teacher competency. In addition, the observation of principals and others, along with the surveys of students and parents, are also sources of evidence that can be used in making this very complex judgment about teacher competency. Student tests, standardized test scores, are not indispensable for making judgments about quality teaching, nor the quality of the teacher preparation programs from which the observed teachers came. So my fourth point is this. There are other quite acceptable sources of data besides standardized achievement tests for judging the efficacy of teacher education programs and their graduates. Even more important and not talked about much is that successful teaching in the secretary's world, teaching that raises student standardized test scores through, say, test preparation, increased homework, teacher merit pay, cash rewards for student performance, and the like, may not be good teaching. Teaching that we think of as good teaching looks different. This distinction between successful practices leading to higher standardized achievement test scores and good practices for educating our youth appears not to be understood by as many educators and politicians as it should be. It's the very heart of the recent book by Young Zhao. Did he get here tonight? Nice. Do in tomorrow. Young Zhao. His new book is called Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Dragon? In contrast to the US system and the Chinese system. Professor Zhao describes how China has both the best and the worst systems of education simultaneously. Their system is the best in the sense that it is remarkably successful in getting very high standardized test scores out of its students. But it is not a good system. It does not graduate creative and democratic citizens, as more commonly occurs from attending public schools in the USA. So point 5 is this. My government's reliance on standardized achievement test scores as the only acceptable source of data about teacher quality will inevitably promote confusion between what we mean by successful instruction on a test and what we mean by good instruction, about some values we hold for what teaching and learning should be like. My sixth point is related to a peculiar problem common to evaluation of competence in both medicine and education. Each field must accommodate a paradox that confuses policymakers in both professions. Paradoxes are difficult to deal with. They seem self-contradictory, as when I say now that teachers and physicians have a huge influence on the lives of students and patients. And I say simultaneously that teachers and physicians don't have much influence on student standardized test scores or measures of longevity. Sounds as if both cannot be true at once. I'm going to try to convince you that they are. Let me explain. A few years ago, I went to my family physician for my annual physical. He put his stethoscope on my chest and looked perplexed. I asked him what was the matter, and he said it was noisy. He heard a lot of sloshing around in there, scared the hell out of me. He referred me to a heart specialist who agreed. The specialist ordered further tests and then informed me that I had a failing heart valve and it needed to be fixed. I quickly had it attended to, and I'm quite happy to be with you here tonight. It is clear then that my family physician saved my life. But what effect did he have on the longevity of Americans? What effect did he have on the death rate of white males in Arizona? What effect did he have on his rating in the local directory of best physicians in Phoenix? Probably none. Those metrics simply do not reflect what my physician did, which was merely to save my life. On the metrics we ordinarily use to judge the competence of American physicians, they are a failing profession. I just showed you the data, it's right there. They appear to be among the worst in the developed world, just as some argue that our education system is among the worst in the developed world. But despite these metrics, wealthy people from all over the world come to the USA to use our hospitals, and they bring their children to use our schools. Why would that happen? I think it's because the metrics we use do not provide the most meaningful data for judging the real achievements of professionals in medicine and education. Wealthy parents from all over the world have figured that out, even if my government and our newspapers have not. My family physician and his colleagues saved my life, while the metrics we ordinarily use to judge physician success hardly moved at all. It makes it quite clear that in medicine, you can save lives and not move metrics. Physicians seem to know that. But it's just as true in education as in medicine. You can literally save lives and not move education's common metrics at all. I think understanding this paradox is a really big insight for me, and I ask you all to think about it. The paradox is described well in medicine by Dr. Danielle Offrey, just published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Just as a teacher might, physician Offrey says the following, quote, "The quarterly report card sits on my desk. Only 33% of my patients with diabetes have glycated hemoglobin levels that are at goal. Only 44% have cholesterol levels at goal. A measly 26% have blood pressure at goal. All my grades as a physician are well below my institutional targets." It's not hard to feel like a failure when the numbers are so abysmal. We've been getting these reports for more than 2 years now, and my numbers never budge. It's wholly dispiriting. She goes on to note, just as a reading teacher in a school serving poor families might note, quote, "These measures focus on diabetes in pristine isolation. But my patients inconveniently carry at least 5 other diagnoses and routinely have medication lists in the double digits," unquote. Yes, Dr. Offrey, you're right to complain. Numbers without context are not merely useless, they're quite misleading, just as a teacher's ability to produce higher test scores when absenteeism rates are out of control. Dr. Offrey also notes that every nurse and physician enters the field to be successful and do good things. And so the incompetence rate among such morally committed and dedicated professionals is actually remarkably low, though it happens. But the system that has been set up to find and remove these few incompetent medical professionals, as with the system used to identify those few incompetent teachers and remove them, is destroying the lives of others in the profession. She notes, I think correctly, that what she calls search and destroy policies are hurting the huge numbers of hardworking and dedicated and competent professionals in medicine and in education. In ways so reminiscent of educators, Dr. Offrey remarks that, quote, "So far, the quantitative reports I receive haven't made me a better doctor. They just make me feel bad. Doctors who actually practice medicine, as opposed to those who develop many of these benchmarks, know that these statistics cannot possibly capture the totality of what it means to take good care of your patients. They merely measure what is easy to measure," unquote. Dr. Offrey makes it clear that one can be a competent, perhaps even a great physician, and still not have the metrics that are used to evaluate her do anything but report her as a failure. Her argument is that the physicians, like teachers, can affect and save the lives of patients or students while not being judged highly by the metrics we use. Something else about medicine and education is also worth noting. Namely, that major changes in the metrics we use to judge each field are much more likely to have their origins in what happens out of the office and out of the classroom than from what happens inside the office or inside the classroom. For example, longevity, one of the metrics we use to judge the medical profession, increased dramatically through the 20th century, but the increased longevity was not due to our physicians. Longevity changed because of changes in public health, events outside the physician's office. Waste treatment plants, indoor plumbing, particularly allowing for the washing of hands, x-ray machines, antibiotics, vaccinations, and other factors were the reasons for the huge increase in longevity, not the physician. The physician had to interpret it, of course, but it wasn't the physician. Out of the office factors, just like out of the school factors, augment or limit the power of individual physicians and individual teachers to affect the data we use to judge each profession. Life expectancy or standardized test scores. Let me describe how these out of school and out of school factors work just like they do in medicine. These are IQ gains over 10 years in Tennessee mountain children, age 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, and 16. In 1930 and 1940, the IQ growth is almost 10 full points on a test that's supposedly impervious to environmental kinds of things, on a test that's supposed to pick up genetic factors, and yet we see a gain of 8 points, and in some cases 10 points. It's a reliable and valid standardized IQ test, and across the decades, things went up a lot. How many teachers can have an effect like that, raise IQ 10 points in a decade? I don't know any, but it happened. And why did it happen? This is a classic in IQ measurement. Kids were tested before the Tennessee Valley Authority was created in the 1930s during our Great Depression, and they were tested after the work was done a decade later. To build the large dams needed to generate hydroelectric power meant a large influx of educated city folks. Along with that came the construction of roads, serving to break the social isolation of rural communities in Tennessee. Perhaps the most important change was the introduction of electricity to thousands of rural homes in Tennessee. This allowed radio for the first time and reading at night. The result is huge gains in test scores, with no change in the teacher's skills, I'm afraid, and no change in curriculum. It was a change in the social environment in which people work. Big change. Let's also look at a sociological event with the opposite effect. A GM plant closed in Flint, Michigan. Its effects were described in the film Roger and Me, produced by Michael Moore in 1989. Some of you probably saw it. Flint was a thriving community in Middle America, average in many, many ways. They had stable churches and families, modest crime rates, and good schools. Flint residents had the dignity and the pleasures that working and middle-class families enjoy when they have economic stability. But the GM plant closed, and Flint's crime rate skyrocketed. Shootouts, murders, and drug use became quite common. Crime became so prevalent that when the ABC news program Nightline tried to do a live story on the plant closings, someone stole the network's van along with the cables, stopping the broadcast in mid-broadcast. In fact, living in Flint became so desperate that Money magazine named Flint, Michigan as the worst place to live in the United States. Schools changed from working in middle-class institutions, and all that implies, to schools that serve the poor, the homeless, drug users and the children of drug users, the children of divorce and chaos. Of course, test scores plummeted. Did we observe a school or a teacher problem or a societal problem? And if we agree that it's a societal problem, then blaming the colleges of education for the teachers' inability to get high scores from the children of Flint is really crazy. So here's a paradox. Professionals in medicine and education are of enormous value to the individuals they treat or teach, but they are less of a factor in determining the metrics with which we judge our physicians or teachers. Physicians affect mortality. Teachers touch eternity, primarily through their care of the individuals for which they have responsibility. So my sixth point is that teachers affect individual students greatly, but standardized test scores only a little. My proof for the first part of the statement is to ask everyone in this room if they remember a teacher that affected the course of their lives, or the lives of their siblings or their children. Think about it. Most of us went into education because someone kind of influenced us. I bet that almost everyone here does remember such a person, and the effects were almost always positive. There are teachers who influenced us in negative ways too. That's taken for granted, but most of those are positive. But these individual successes of teachers do not usually show up on the standardized achievement tests currently used to judge teachers or the institutions that train them. Now let's also take a closer look at the tests. First, noting that the year-to-year correlations of student scores on standardized achievement tests is quite high, often as high as 0.8. While that may indicate substantial reliability, which is good if you're assessing students, it also indicates great stability in where the students rank every year. That's bad if you're expecting teachers to have effects on the students they teach. With correlations from year to year this high, we see that up to 2/3 of the variance in students' test scores is already accounted for by last year's test scores. Okay? Now, you can do some statistical controls. The question is whether you get all of that effect out. And I would argue I don't think you can. Only about 1/3 of the variance in this year's standardized test scores is free to be affected by other factors. Past schooling and family life, along with classroom cohorts that we attend school with in any one year we measure achievement, affect the standardized achievement test scores greatly. In fact, there is evidence that the classroom and school cohorts that one goes to school with are even more powerful than the standard sociological variables first described by James Coleman 50 years ago. Coleman, you might remember, shocked the educational research community by demonstrating what is now common knowledge, namely that teachers' effect on student standardized test scores is a lot less than our neighborhoods and families. We got to thinking that teachers have no effects after the Coleman report because it didn't show up on the tests. Teachers have huge effects. It's just that the tests are not sensitive to those. That's what I'm trying to argue. Variance, I'm going to start skipping to get to where we need to go. A reasonable estimate of how variance in standardized tests works its way out comes from Ed Hartle at Stanford. This diagram comes from him. What you have is the variance accounted for by standardized, by different factors on standardized tests. And about 20% of the variance is unaccounted for, common in social science measures, error term we call it. But outside the school variables account for about 60% of the variance we see in test scores, standardized achievement test scores. These are effects associated with the social and economic growth brought about by the TVA or the disaster that occurred in Flint, Michigan. They're outside of school factors. Here are some of the myriad variables that affect these test scores, making the tests and the VAMs used to judge the efficacy of teachers in the schools they attended pretty difficult to do. Here's a list of outside of school factors, exogenous variables in another language, the percent of low birth weight children in the neighborhood, the inadequate medical, dental, and vision care in family and neighborhood, food insecurity in family, environmental pollutants in home and neighborhood, family relations and family stress, percent of mothers at the school site that are single in their teens. This goes on by the dozens. And the question is whether you can control it all statistically, and I would argue you can't. Not all of them. As you might guess, what happens at the schools in which teachers work also affects the achievement of students that a teacher has, independent of what the teacher might be doing inside his or her classroom. We go back here, we see that classroom effects are about 10%. School effects, not classroom effects, are about 10%. What are these classroom effects? Inside the school factors affecting what occurs inside the classroom, but not under teacher control, making it hard to make an inference about teaching. Class size, that's not under teacher control. Does class size make a difference in outcomes? Sure. Quality of the principal and other administrators, collective efficacy of the faculty, teacher turnover and school churn rates, quality of the school facilities, quality and frequency of professional development opportunities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I might add, there's a new report out on professional development opportunities that says there is no effect of the millions and millions of dollars, billions of dollars being spent on professional development. What did they use as a measure? One of the standardized achievement tests. Okay? If it's insensitive, then that's the kind of inference you'll make. Anyway, the estimate is about 10% of the effects, the variance is accounted for by the teacher. Hartle's estimates were found to be quite reasonable by the prestigious American Statistical Association. They estimate that the variance in student standardized test scores that can be accounted for by teachers is between 1% and 14%. There's backup in another way. Imagine you have identical twins. They have the same teacher or a different teacher, but they take the same standardized achievement test. In such a study, which has actually been conducted, you can estimate the teacher effects by differences in the scores obtained by the identical twins if they have the same standardized achievement test. Same teacher, different teacher. Precisely this kind of study estimates that an upward bound for the variance in the tests that can be attributable to teachers is 8%. Not much of a teacher effect at all. We have another study that does the same thing. I'm going to jump over that. Teachers are not affecting test scores very much, is my point. And yet the test scores are used as ways to blame teachers, schools of education in New Orleans, Chicago, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, and dozens of other cities where teachers and schools of education are blamed for sins they have not committed. The variance accounted for argument substantiates my sixth point, namely that although teachers may have profound effects on individual students, they do not affect standardized achievement test scores much at all. I'm going to move quicker now and just work my way through some of this. There's my 14 points. I've covered 6 of them. And I have a hunch you'll start leaving soon if I wanted to stay covering them all. But let's talk about 7. Point 7, teachers' effects on standardized achievement test scores fade quickly. Most of the people using VAMs, economists who have looked for what's the effect of a teacher over time, most of them found out that you lose about 50% of the effect the second year, and you lose about 75% of the effect the third year. Why would you evaluate teachers' competency in schools of education with metrics that don't show their effect after a while? Sounds a little odd to me. 8, observational measures of teacher competency and achievement tests of teacher competency do not correlate well. We have a number of instruments. Lauren and I have used them for years. Those of us who do classroom observations use them. Len Cairns have used them. These purport to capture excellence in teaching. Okay? We have standardized achievement tests that people are saying captures excellence in teaching. What's the correlation between them? typically no more than 0.3, sometimes lower, suggesting that only 10% of the variance that you find in an observational measure of excellence is found in the Standardized Achievement Test measure of excellence. That's hardly any overlap. And you got two measures. What does it tell you? One or both of them are wrong. That's what it tells you. You can't make those inferences with that being the case. Now, what we have in the United States is that the test is being used as the criteria to judge the observation instrument. But we might ask, why not use the observation instrument as the criteria to judge the test? They are not correlating. That's clear. The big Gates study that was just done found correlation 0.3 and under, okay? So we really have a problem trying to figure out how to capture excellence in teaching and therefore in the schools of education that train them. Different standardized achievement tests, both purporting to measure reading or math or science at the same grade level, will give different estimates of teacher competency. We're not sure what the construct is. If I give reading test A, reading test B, and reading test C, all of which are reading tests in the 5th grade, they give completely different estimates of who's an excellent teacher. That means we have problems defining what the construct is these tests are measuring, and why would we then depend on one of them and not the other? We haven't sorted that out yet, and it's a big problem for us. It turns out that same study, the administration of standardized achievement tests at different times of the year will yield different estimates of teacher effectiveness. So if I give them a month apart in different schools, I'm going to get different estimates of who's doing well or not. That strikes me as a difficult thing to justify then. Here's one Professor Jim Popham and I have been working on for 20 years now. There are no standardized achievement tests that I know of or he knows of that have provided proof that their items are instructionally sensitive. Now, I have no doubt that the items locate kids well in distributions of knowledge and skill that you're measuring. But if you want to make an inference about a teacher, you have to be able to show that if excellent teaching took place, the item showed an effect. Okay? So almost every standardized achievement test is a tryout. They try to get items roughly at about the 50th percentile of passers and failers. They got a little boundary there. They're trying to get items, and they know what they can expect as a pass rate for the item. If one of the greatest teachers in the community teaches a unit for which those items are relevant, and you can't move the pass rate, you have an instructionally insensitive test. There is no evidence that any test used to evaluate teachers, any standardized achievement test, has ever subject their items to that test. If you can't make a claim that the items will react to good instruction, how can you make a claim that it's tapping excellence in instruction? You can't, in my estimation. Point 12, teacher effects show up more dramatically on teacher-made tests than on standardized achievement tests, because the former are based on the enacted curriculum, while the latter are based on the desired curriculum. We have evidence now that the correlations between teachers' logs of what they teach and the items on a standardized test correlate about 0.14. Okay? Somebody in Pearson, somebody in a State Department, somebody designing NAPLAN is saying what you should be teaching. And a teacher's saying, I guess, okay, goodbye. Close the door. So no wonder these tests are so insensitive. It turns out, again, I could show you maybe, I'll show you one more. Here's 3 kinds of tests. We can call them near, close, and distant. A near test is one developed by teachers, and we have this little group of, these are all meta-analyses. We have teacher-made tests, the meta-analysis for learning science. It turns out that teachers have 5 times the effect on the teacher-made test that they did on the standardized achievement test. So if you want to know if a teacher's having an effect and you're using the standardized achievement test, you're much better off using the teacher's test to see a teacher effect. That's true. The rest of these are not teacher tests, they're researcher tests, which I'm calling near to instruction, though not close to instruction. And these are all distal from instruction. And it turns out that you get 7 times greater sensitivity when you move from a standardized test to a researcher-developed test, someone who knows the curriculum and what was being taught. So my point here is I'm running fast, and that's always a danger. Teacher effects show up more dramatically on teacher-made tests than on standardized achievement tests, because the former are actually based on the enacted curriculum, while the latter are based on the desired curriculum. 13, we now have opt-out as a testing movement in the United States. Parents, by the literally tens of thousands, are keeping their kids home from standardized testing. They say, it's wasting my kids' time. I don't want to do it. Well, if you don't know characteristics of those kids, you'll never be able to make an inference about teaching and learning from them. Finally, the secretary wants to assess new teachers with standardized achievement tests. That's likely to yield a lot of false negatives, because new teachers are learning their craft. We're probably going to identify a whole bunch of people who really are bad on the test and 4 years later might be quite adequate and quite good. And this is occurring at a time when the United States is having a teacher shortage. Okay, so now you've got all my points. I really could go for hours on those, but I'm going to save you that and jump to a conclusion. Okay. Given all this, what are the policy fiascos that my title that I referred to? Well, headlines the other day when I was here in Australia said, NAPLAN scores stagnate. Another headline was, teachers need improvement. Okay, I've just argued that that's a rough inference from the test scores. I don't think you make that improvement. I'm all for improving teaching, please understand me, but I do not think teaching will increase NAPLAN scores. As I have demonstrated, standardized achievement tests are remarkably insensitive to teacher effects. You want to improve the NAPLAN? Reduce unemployment in the community 1%. You want to improve the NAPLAN? Increase or decrease the number of single girls having children. I can give you a whole list of sociological variables. Increase the high school graduation rate. That'll get your NAPLAN scores up a lot better than improving teaching. In the USA, we have the Common Core now as the new curriculum. It's a way to improve, it was sold partly as a way to improve us on the international tests, because our average scores are rather modest on the international tests. Yet 13 million kids, those kids who are in schools where under 25% of the families are in poverty, they score among the top in the world. So is it a curriculum problem, or is it a sociological problem and an income problem and a social class problem? Now, I'm not against the new Common Core necessarily, but it's demonstrably false that that's the problem in America, okay? That sort of thing. In Alberta, Canada, where I do some consulting, Professor John Hattie's work is the basis of a lot of professional development in some schools. And by the way, John Hattie and I just met again after 40 years or so. We worked together when he looked a lot younger. I don't know about me, but we were younger then. I admire what Professor Hattie has done, and I always recommend his work as a basis for professional development and teacher education coursework. But I do not expect the work that he does to influence standardized achievement test scores very much, if at all. It is asking for a kind of sensitivity to instruction that these tests do not possess. Will it change teacher-made test scores? I think so. It's better instruction. Will it change the standardized achievement test scores? We're not accounting for enough variance. They're not sensitive enough. Teacher-made tests, a new study of the professional development that just came out. Okay. My argument today also explains why Teach for America's new and grossly untrained teachers do not seem any worse on standardized achievement tests given to poor children than do experienced teachers. The tests are simply too insensitive to instructional quality while being highly reactive to the income, social class, quality of the neighborhoods, and the home lives that are presented by the students of Teach for America instructors, as well as their better trained and more experienced fellow instructors. As you can guess, I believe that there is nothing to recommend using standardized achievement test scores, or the VAMs that rely on them, as the primary source of data for judging teachers or the institutions that prepare them. Sadly, this is not simply an issue for educators to solve. There are corporate interests involved in decisions to use standardized tests this way, even if used in invalid ways. To me, it's similar to pharmaceutical companies pushing the use of drugs in ways that are not originally recommended. Off-label drug use, and its equivalent, off-label test use, can result in a great deal of money being made by pharmaceutical companies and testing companies, but it's not right. I think you've been patient long enough and have grasped my point by now. Point is simple. There really are better, though more expensive ways to judge the competency of our teachers in our colleges of education. We should pay the price and not use invalid assessments that could diminish rather than increase the effects of our teachers on our students in this hugely important profession for both our countries. I hope that you in Australia can fight this trend if it drifts over the ocean. We can use standardized achievement tests to judge students and what they know and can do, but I would not use them at all for judging your schools of education or for making a lot of strong inferences about the quality of instruction. So thank you for listening.
Folks, I think when I look back on my career, there are a number of people who I consider my heroes. These are people who I'm sure you have in your career too, that everything they write, you make an effort to find and read. And in that list, I include people like Michael Scriven, who I was his boss for 14 years. I include Jean Glass. I include Linda Darling-Hammond, Jim Popham, our good friend Dick Yeager, but I also include our speaker tonight. I started with David, I think it was back in the 70s, with the textbook, Educational Psychology. And it's gone through, I think, 8 or 10 editions. It's still available there. It's quite one of the most stunning textbooks in the education psychology area. Also, The Manufactured Crisis. I think that book said a tremendous amount that shook the American nation when it came out, but it did another thing that David is very adept at. It invented a phrase which has lasted long beyond where the book has gone, and I hear it so often, and I certainly use that notion in my own work about the crises that people create to deflect from what really matters in this business. I think tonight you've had a feast, both in terms of the evidence, in terms of the advocacy. Certainly you heard the passion, but like David's work, you have plenty to take home and digest and chew on this evening. This turn of phrase that Michael has, and I certainly noticed is one of his more recent books, the 50 Myths and Lies. And at the time, I don't know if it still said this, there was a group of you called the Contrarians, which is many of the people I mentioned before, which is trying to bring back a debate in education. That really makes a difference. Certainly I wrote a paper a couple of months ago called The Politics of Distraction. And certainly if any of you have looked at that, the whole David Berline approach comes across so strongly that there are so many things we raise in this business that distract from what the real issues are. And I'm sorry to say that not only do politicians do it, so often teachers do it. And whilst we had tonight a talk about the reasons of what we should not do, I certainly hasten to add that David has written, and I hope that he was going to write the second paper to this about the 14 reasons about how we can identify and esteem the expertise that the teachers have in our profession. Because one of the things that strike me so often is that we are a profession that very often denies our expertise. And it doesn't take long in this business to see success. It is all around us. We don't have the courage to see it so often, but more often it's this distraction, it's this manufactured crisis that gets in the way. David, you've introduced me to some new technical terms tonight that I think we can all use in future. Ludicrous, pissing me off, teaching towards eternity. The power to convince. Your power to convince is dramatic. I think it's a lesson for all of us tonight. Yes, you can write for the learned journals, but if you're going to have an effect on the Arnie Duncans, on the systems of the world, you have to have that passion to convince and use damn good evidence, but do it in a way, and maybe do it 14 times. David, when you decide that it's time to stop writing articles, can I say to you, to remind yourself of your slide here this evening, please, come and spend your last 4 years in Australia. You would be extremely welcomed. And please, could you join me to say to David tonight, thank you tonight for our Dean's lecture. Thank you tonight for bringing some reality back to this discussion. You may or may not disagree with him, but my goodness, he's on the right topic. 4 more years. Thank you.